Hopes of a rate cut pushes the ASX to a new record with implications for investors and politics. Weight loss miracle drugs set to flow into the Australian market, and the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks to be sentenced to nearly 3,000 years jail. Welcome to Fear and Greed Daily Business News. For people who make their own decisions, it is Friday, the 2nd of August 2024. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
The main story this morning, Sean, the local share market hit a new record high yesterday as the US Central Bank confirmed a rate cut is on the way, and odds for a reduction in local rates by the end of the year shortened.
There's plenty of excitement in the market at the moment, maybe too much excitement, Michael. Yesterday, the S&P ASX 200 pushed through 8,100 points for the first time, hit about 8,145 points before finishing at 8,115 points. It follows the Consumer Price Index data from the Bureau of Statistics on Wednesday, which show underlying inflation, which takes out volatile items and is the one that the Reserve Bank prefers. It shows that underlying inflation is slowing. That triggered a rethink of what's next for interest rates locally. Those that thought there was another hike in the offing have backtracked, while some high-profile economists, notably from Commonwealth Bank and Westpac, reckon the first cut will occur in November this year, not next year. Bond markets are fully priced in a cut by February next year. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve said it could start lowering interest rates as soon as September after holding rates at a 23-year high for the 8th meeting in a row. Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell said there'd been a real discussion at the Federal Open Market Committee about cutting rates, but the world's most important central bank wants to see further progress towards lowering inflation to its 2% goal. Put all of that together, the ASX 200 rallied to a new high.
All right, so a rate cut in the US and here should help corporate earnings, hence the rally. I understand all of that. Beyond markets, Sean, it no doubt has some political implications as well.
Yes, very good question. I'd guarantee that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is hoping for a rate cut ahead of announcing any federal poll, which must be held by May next year. The cost of living crisis is hurting everyday Australians. It's also hurting voters' view of the government. So a rate cut would definitely be welcomed by Labor. Same deal in the US. No doubt Kamala Harris, the incumbent, well, Joe Biden's the incumbent, but the Democrats are the incumbents. No doubt Kamala Harris would love a rate cut in the world's biggest economy before November. What's interesting in your question, Michael, is actually the first part. The theory says lower rates means reducing pressures on corporate and household balance sheets. Fair enough, that should boost earnings and share markets. In practice, that actually hasn't always been the case when monetary policy cycles have turned and you've ended up with these sustained cuts in rates. It might be that rates are being cut because economies are slowing sharply. That's bad for earnings. Currently, there's also all this geopolitical risk around the place, especially around the Middle East. There's growing skepticism about short-term returns from artificial intelligence. Markets are already highly valued. We're talking about the market being at a record high just as we head into earnings season. So, theoretically, yes, all this should mean higher markets, but I wouldn't put my money on it.
I just love that just as I feel like I'm getting a handle on something, I feel like I've been absorbing enough from you over the last few years that I'm like, yep, I can make an assumption here and put this out there. Then all of a sudden you just come in with, well, in theory that might be right, but in practice it doesn't always happen. Okay, cheers. Thanks for that, Sean. You've just set my education back about 3 years.
But that's how. That's why we have trillions of dollars in share markets. If we knew what was going to happen, well, we wouldn't be here having a Fear and Greed podcast, would they?
That's a very good point. Now, the local market obviously hit a new high yesterday, up 0.3%. Which stocks did best?
Well, there were a bunch of stocks that were doing okay, only to fade later in the day. National Australia Bank, for example, ended the day down more than 1%. Commonwealth Bank was off 0.7%. It was really the tech stocks and real estate investment trusts that did best. Goodman Group jumped 3.6%. Xero was up 2%. Rio, following its bumper profit on Wednesday, jumped 2%, while Woodside and Woolies also did well. Bit of corporate news around yesterday. Australian Indigenous leader, social advocate and lawyer Noel Pearson has joined the board of iron ore miner Fortescue as a non-executive director. Australia's competition watchdog said it won't oppose Louis Dreyfus's proposed acquisition of Namoi Cotton, despite concerns the deal could lessen competition in the supply of cotton ginning services in the north of Western Australia and Northern Territory, one of your favourite industries, the cotton ginning services. And Nemoy's share price jumped 6%. And Defence Technology Group Drone Shield completed a $120 million capital raise. It started trading again. Its share price fell 15%.
Sean, international markets now, thanks to Blue Chip Communication, the experts helping financial services companies market, communicate, and grow. Visit bluechipcommunication.com.au. I would ask you, just basically based on what the US Fed said about rates, I would make some assumptions about what the implications of that would be. But I'm over making assumptions now. I feel like I've been put back in my box.
Well, it's a fair point, because some commodities, well, you would think commodities would do well. You would think, because the idea of you're cutting interest rates, you're boosting activity, you're boosting growth in major economies. That should help commodities. So copper was higher, iron ore was higher, oil was also higher, but it didn't have much to do with interest rates. That's more about the tension in the Middle East, you see.
God, today is just one of those days that just throws everything out. Like, you just assume that things are going to go one way, and instead it's a whole bunch of different kind of factors all combining. I'm just going to sit back and just let you talk for a bit.
Well, yeah. See, well, the Aussie dollar's back above 65 US cents. A couple of things I do want to talk about. Japan. We don't talk a lot about Japan, but it's still the world's third or fourth largest economy. Kind of dukes that one out with Germany behind the US and China. Really important for Australia, because we sell lots of coal and iron ore and aluminium and beef to Japan. Now, earlier in the week, the Bank of Japan lifted the benchmark interest rate to 0.25%. We mentioned that. Japan's had low interest rates, not for the last couple of years, for about 25 years. I mean, it's even had negative interest rates. Suddenly, rates are rising. That's pushed up the value of the yen. Not necessarily good for Aussie holiday makers, but good for people selling stuff to Japan. It's also pushed down the Nikkei stock average. That's the market over there. So plenty going on in Japan, and it is a powerhouse economy. It's just that because it's been in the doldrums and low interest rates for years and years and years, we don't really focus much on it. But if that decides to start growing and buying lots of stuff from Australia, very good news for us. Also, can't not mention Nvidia. Its share price has been falling all week until yesterday. In one session, it jumped 13%. That is 329 billion US dollars, about 500 billion Aussie dollars. It smashed the best one-day rise in terms of value ever, which admittedly was a record it set a few months back. But imagine that, adding $500 billion to your value in one session.
Yeah, that is extraordinary. Now, Sean, we've got a fair bit still to get through. Quick mention of the interview, though, that you have coming up after the show. An interesting one. It's slightly different today. One of our supporters on Fear and Greed is AHM Health Insurance. And today we're taking a closer look at the health insurance industry. We are speaking with Tim Bennett from Finder.
It's really fascinating. We talk about health insurance, or private health insurance, how that compares with our public Medicare system, who should be using it, whether they're anyone who shouldn't need private health insurance, and then stuff about what to look for when you're taking out cover, the extras. I must say I learned a lot in this interview, because private health insurance is one of those things you think, I suppose, and certainly as you get older, you definitely need it. But Tim had such in-depth knowledge about the sector itself. It was a really fascinating chat.
Yeah, and he's a real insurance expert, kind of assessing policies right across the sector and the entire kind of sector as an entirety. The entire sector as an entirety.
That's last word.
That's a new one for me, right?
No, I'm not sure.
Anyway, it is a great interview. It is coming up after the show, so stick around for that one. Stick around as well, because in a moment we'll be back with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, only 5 out of 19 closing the gap targets are on track, according to the Productivity Commission, prompting Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to say generational inequality for Indigenous Australians won't be solved overnight.
Mr Albanese said the government was still committed to closing the gap targets, but change would not be immediate, according to a report on AAP. But advocates said Indigenous Australians were somewhere between disappointed and frustrated at the lack of traction in addressing the targets, with some saying approaches by the federal government were not working. The Productivity Commission's annual data compilation report released yesterday shows efforts to reduce rates of incarceration, out-of-home care and suicide are not on track to hit specified targets. The most recent data shows suicide was the leading cause of death for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people aged 15 to 39. Quite shocking. As well, the Commission noted the life expectancy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men is less than 72 years and 75.6 years for women. For non-Indigenous people, it's 81 and 85.3 for women. However, some good news. Targets for healthy birth weights, preschool enrolments and Indigenous employment are heading towards fulfilment by 2031.
Sean, just on the topic of the Productivity Commission, yesterday we released a bonus episode of Fear and Greed. We do this every Tuesday and Thursday called Ask Fear and Greed. And one of our listeners by the name of Duncan asked a question about the Productivity Commission and why when the Commission is putting out a lot of detailed reports into some very kind of worthy topics, why a lot of the recommendations aren't necessarily adopted, or why the Productivity Commission and the government policy often seem to be at loggerheads. And you did a lot of research and looked into this and kind of went into the history of the Productivity Commission and how many times in the past the recommendations have been adopted. It's a really interesting episode. It's only 5 minutes long. I would definitely recommend going back and having a listen to it. It came out at midday yesterday.
Yeah, one of the great things about Ask Fear and Greed is I get to sort of think about stuff like the Productivity Commission and its role in society and kind of whether it adds value or not. And that's what this episode's all about. It's, a really interesting little, well, I'm talking, so maybe I shouldn't say it's interesting because you should be the judge of that yourself. But I found it fascinating.
Yeah. So you're essentially saying that you found yourself fascinating.
Yeah, I think so.
That sounds like the kind of thing I would say on the weekend edition. Now, Sean, moving on, Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers has hinted that the government is at least considering injecting equity into the failed Rex airline.
Essentially, Dr. Chalmers said he wouldn't rule out intervening in Rex, Regional Express, after it went into administration on Tuesday night. When asked on ABC's Radio National whether the government would take an equity stake in the embattled regional airline, Chalmers said the government was having serious conversations about all of our options. Later in the day, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese suggested a reason for Rex's failure was due to its attempt to break into the competitive Sydney-Melbourne route. It also emerged yesterday that Rex asked EY, the financial services firm, to conduct a review of its strategy months before it went into administration.
Weight loss drug supplies in Australia are set to improve dramatically as the company behind Ozempic prepares to provide its version of the medication that's specifically designed for patients seeking to shed kilograms.
Drug maker Novo Nordisk's decision to finally launch its powerful Wegovy medication in Australia resolves the prospect of supply shortage in October when chemist-made versions of Ozempic were scheduled to be banned. Until now, Australians have only been able to buy limited supplies of Ozempic, which is officially licensed as a diabetes treatment rather than for weight loss. The Australian Financial Review is reporting that Novo Nordisk is planning to begin offering its weight loss drug Wegovy in Australia this month. Patients will need a prescription from their doctor and the drug will not be on the subsidised pharmaceutical benefits scheme. The cost is yet to be revealed. Now, Wegovy comes in higher doses than Ozempic. That makes it more effective for weight loss and has been approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration since 2022 but never sold in Australia.
Now, Albemarle, which is the world's largest lithium producer, will cut 300 jobs from its Australian operations and slow down its production of the commodity.
Yesterday, the group said it will stop constructing the third production unit at its Comerton facility south of Perth and put the second unit into care and maintenance. Instead, it will focus on ramping up Unit 1 within the lithium hydroxide processing plant. It follows a sharp drop in lithium spodumene prices, which are down 88% from the peak in 2022. Western Australia has now lost around 7,000 jobs in the nickel and lithium industries since prices of both commodities started tumbling.
All right, turning to international news now, and Donald Trump has questioned Vice President Kamala Harris's identity as a black woman in front of an audience of black journalists, suggesting his opponent for the presidency has adopted her racial profile as a way to gain a political advantage.
In comments that were jeered by the audience, Mr. Trump said, I quote, "She was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn and she became a black person," end quote. Now, Ms. Harris's mother is Indian American. Her father is Jamaican. She's always identified as a black woman, according to the New York Times. She went to one of the most famous black universities in the US. Mr. Trump's remarks prompted gasps and jeers from the audience at the National Association of Black Journalists in Chicago. The former president's combative appearance was one of the more unusual of the campaign so far, as he sparred with reporters over diversity efforts, repeated falsehoods about a range of subjects, and told the group that he was the best president for the black population since Abraham Lincoln.
Now, Sean, I mentioned this one at the top of the show. The alleged mastermind of the September 11, 2001 attacks on the US will be spared the death penalty as part of a plea agreement that aims to end years of legal wrangling over his treatment by the CIA and interrogation under torture in Guantanamo Bay.
59-year-old Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is accused of plotting with the late al-Qaeda founder Osama bin Laden to hijack planes and fly them into the World Trade Center and Pentagon, will now receive a minimum sentence of 2,976 years in a military tribunal, according to a report in the Financial Times. The Pentagon, which announced the plea deal, said it had also reached agreements with two other defendants who were first charged alongside Mohammed 16 years ago. The exact terms of their pleas were not disclosed by the US government, but the trio are expected to plead guilty and avoid a full trial. Mohammed was captured in 2003 in Pakistan, was held at CIA prisons before being sent to Guantanamo Bay. The agency has since been found to have subjected him to waterboarding, a form of torture, at least 183 times.
Meta founder Mark Zuckerberg says strength in the group's core advertising business will allow the company to continue spending heavily on artificial intelligence next year and beyond, triggering an 8% jump in its share price.
The company's Meta AI chatbot was also on track to become the most used AI assistant in the world by the end of the year, Mr. Zuckerberg said, went on to say that while products such as chatbots would increase engagement with Meta's platform, it would take years for the monetization of any of those things by themselves. Revenue at the social media group jumped 22% to $39 billion in the past 3 months. That was better than expected. Net income at Meta, of course we're talking Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp here, rose 73% to $13.5 billion, also better than expected.
Up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Tim Bennett from Finder.
All about private health insurance, who needs it, when you need it, what you should look for.
Yeah, it's a great chat. It is up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Michael.
It is Friday, the 2nd of August, 2024. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.